The last chapter in this lecture is a pretty heavy chunk, pretty large chunk. It's Victorian poetry. So I'll start it in 1830 because in heavily summarized terms, 1830 marks the beginning of a new age when Alfred Lord Tennyson, that's Alfred, Lord Tennyson, because he was not born a lord, he was made a lord. And for the first generation, when you are made a lord, you cannot be Lord XYZ. You have to be XYZ, Lord this. So yes, when Alfred Lord Tennyson published his poems, chiefly lyrical, though Romanticism was still palpable in Tennyson's verse, and post-Romanticism remained traceable as far as the early verse production of W.B. Yeats in the 1890s, a new sensibility emerged with more realism, greater pessimism, private introspection and sentimentality, and of course a greater sense of social and moral responsibility, going hand in hand with greater awareness of immediate contemporary surroundings. From the consequences of the Industrial Revolution to the rise of science and the harsh facts it revealed. Exploration of past ages as a comparative alternative world also went far beyond what Romanticism had initiated. First and foremost, with the Middle Ages, stemming in part from Southey's resurrection of Malory's Morted Arthur, with a new edition in 1817. Then, with a later obsession for the Renaissance. Using all types of meter and formats, Victorian poets were specifically major exponents of the dramatic monologue. Now, this is explained further down. So first we must start with High Victorian poetry, from the 1830s to the 1860s. The number one figure is, I've already mentioned him, Alfred Lord Tennyson. He is the Victorian poet par excellence. He was made Poet Laureate in 1850 following the death of Wordsworth, with Prince Albert's support. He was fondly appreciated by Queen Victoria herself and by millions of her subjects. He was quite an establishment figure. He was called by T.S. Eliot the most perfect conformist, but he was also a somber, passionate traveller through life, often identifying himself with Ulysses or Merlin, and therefore T.S. Eliot also called him the most instinctive rebel. He probably had, and again that's another judgment by T.S. Eliot, probably the best musical ear of all English poets. So for each of these poets I have listed a number of key works and a number of key poems. We cannot go into all of them. Next in the Trinity, so to speak, is Browning. So if you want to memorize, I think you should do it by groups. So you remember Romanticism, first generation, Coleridge and Wordsworth, possibly Southey, and then the Holy Trinity of Shelley, Byron and Keats. Now with the Victorian poets, well, you have Tennyson, Browning and Arnold. Okay, so Browning. Browning is difficult and definitely the opposite of Tennyson in as much as he is unmusical. He was the arch exponent of the dramatic monologue. A dramatic monologue is a sort of narrative poem in which a single first-person speaker reveals himself and his life experience by addressing an imaginary audience of other characters. So it's narrative, but not in the direct way. It's narrative through drama. It's almost as a kind of, sort of reflective one-man show in a way. This is the favourite verse form of the Victorian era. The speaking persona in the dramatic monologue is not the poet, and the characters are not his readers, but some sort of communion ensues, because of course the readers imagine the persona is the poet, and the people he is talking to in the poem, well, the readers imagine it's them, and that the poet is actually addressing them. Browning lived in Italy after his, there is a very romantic story of courtship and elopement with his wife, Elizabeth Browning. They escaped and then they lived in Italy until her death in 1861. Still, although he was away in Italy, the communion effect drew in a passionate crowd of followers. They organized Browning societies. They were always, they met together to read his poems, trying to enjoy the difficulty, the obscurity, the lack of rhythm. They try to share in the sentiment. And again, this is typically Victorian. In Romanticism, the poet is separate from the mainstream. He is isolated from society, sometimes even in opposition with society. Now, in Victorian times, the poet is in communion with society. The third major high Victorian poet is Matthew Arnold, the severe, serious, highly intellectual thinker and essayist. I think I've already told you he was a general inspector of schools by profession. He advocated high culture and education, the alliance of Greek sweetness and light with the more sturdy qualities of Roman and Hebraic heritage as a substitute to waning religion. I think I've mentioned it, the religion of culture, as a sort of replacement religion to fight the vulgarities of the Philistines, and that's the middle classes, of course, and the oncoming chaos of anarchy and decline. When you read the poems, you have some of this, but the dominant note is that of melancholy, like all the other Victorian poets, and the trends we have already mentioned today. Pessimism, oh yes, and this this attempt to escape, fly away. For him, it was the Alps, for instance. He wrote a poem about the Grande Chartreuse, and there was also the shadow of his father. He was trying to escape. So again, list of keywords and a few major poems. Other poets in this high Victorian period? Some minor ones like Arthur Clough and Edward Fitzgerald, who is famous for his translation of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, admired by Tennyson and Rossetti and etc., etc. But the only important one is Browning's wife, Elizabeth Barrett Browning. She was a poet in her own right. She was a long-suffering invalid. She had a tyrannical father who had forbidden his children to marry. This is why she had to escape to Italy with Robert Browning. She is far more progressive in her ideas. She supported women's rights and also the Italian Risorgimento. Now, after dealing with high Victorian poetry, which corresponds roughly to the early Victorian era, we must move on to pre-Raphaelite poetry, corresponding more or less to the mid-Victorian era, from the 40s to the mid-60s. So at the heart of this period, we find poets connected with the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, also known as PRB. Now, this is a sort of gathering, informal gathering of mainly painters and a few sculptors as well, people connected with the visual arts, but also with poetry. And it's very interesting because most of them were connected to the poets that came before them and the poets that came after them. So much so that Rossetti, Swinburne, and some later aesthetes were often lumped together by moral critics, moralizing critics, you might even say. They were lumped together as the fleshly school of poetry. Why? Because they shared a fascination for sensual delight, idealized or not. They admired young Tennyson, who himself had kept alive Keatsian sensuousness. Tennyson was also, as we saw, a great admirer of things medieval, and so were the PreRaphaelites. They even illustrated Tennyson's poems in a famous book edition in 1857, known as the Moxon edition. So, who were they? They were a series of artists. Well, Millet, the Rossetti brothers, Holman Hunt, Wilner, Stevenson, Collinson. They formed a sort of club, the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, in order basically to advertise their paintings. They had a first exhibition at the Royal Academy in 1849, and with the support of the famous critic John Ruskin, they rose to fame. Soon they broke with Ruskin, and they drifted apart, everyone going, each going their own way. Rossetti never ceased to produce both paintings and poems. Moreover, they engaged in a very interesting project, the Oxford Union Murals. This was about illustrating with frescoes a premises at the University of Oxford that were, it's a library, you can still see it today, but they were really amateurs with the fresco technique, and the frescoes have somehow faded, but you can still see them today. And this is where they met two key figures of the next generation. You might call them second generation Pre-Raphaelites, William Morris and Edward Burne-Jones. Now, if you want more details about the name of Pre-Raphaelite, what it meant, and the connection with Ruskin, have a look at the footnotes. That will explain everything. So I'll go quickly over some of them, the most important ones. So first generation Pre-Raphaelite, Dante Gabriel Rossetti. Of course, it should be pronounced Rossetti, but the English pronunciation is Z, Rossetti. Now, of course, he was of Italian descent. He translated Italian poets, and also French poets like Villon, François Villon. There are some very fine translations. He also wrote very often poems for his own pictures. There are some 50 of them. His whole life is almost like a poem itself. He was fascinated by his first wife, his wife Elizabeth Siddal, who tragically died in 1862. And all his life he was fascinated with women, what the Pre-Raphaelites called the stunners, those extraordinary models they used for their paintings. And if you see a Pre-Raphaelite painting today, I'm sure you will immediately understand that it's always the same physical type in a way. The second most important woman in his life was Jane Morris. She was the wife of William Morris, but in fact Rossetti was her lover. They had a sort of ménage à trois. It was really, really weird. Anyway, apart from women, fate is one of his major themes in his poetry, and he was also among those poets who in the 19th century picked up the romantic tradition of addiction. With Rossetti, it was not opium, it was chloral, which was a kind of, sleeping draught of the period. Anyway, his great poems are not only connected with pictures, but also with other art forms. For instance, The Blessed Damozel was put into music by Debussy much later on. Next, second generation Pre-Raphaelite, we have William Morris. There are so many things to be said about William Morris. He was not only a poet, but as we saw him, we've already mentioned him in connection with his Utopia, News from Nowhere, but he was also a craftsman. He did incredible things to revive arts and crafts in Britain. He really produced things with his own hands. He even printed his own books, having designed the types. He created a firm, Morris and Company, who tried to sell everything from wallpapers to furniture to try and bring back to Britain a degree of general beauty, even within the home. So, as a poet, he's not that great actually, but I would say he is of major importance to understand the circulation of ideas throughout the century. Next, I must mention Rossetti's sister, Christina Rossetti. Just as William, another talented Rossetti brother, Christina contributed to the Pre-Raphaelite magazine, The Germ, well, short-lived magazine actually, but she was much more religious than her brother, deeply religious, withdrawn to the point of seclusion. Nonetheless, when you read her poems, you will find the same sensuousness that is perhaps the guiding idea that goes through this mid-Victorian period. A number of minor poets can also be mentioned. Coventry Patmore, for instance, not very fundamental. Finally, we come to aestheticism in poetry, as well as in the rest of literature, and that corresponds to the late Victorian period. Key figure is Algernon Charles Swinburne, who published his Atalanta in Caledon in 65, and then Poems and Ballads in 66. He was a friend of the Pre-Raphaelites, but he also had traits that were somehow different from them, and that make him the ideal transition link towards the end of the century. The trouble was he was a bizarre character. Actually, he was physically bizarre because he was very small, with a huge head, and he also had some strange proclivities. He was apparently a complete masochist, but that's not the most important thing. The most important thing in terms of literary history is that he brought to Britain what you might call art for art's sake. This is the famous phrase first used by Théophile Gautier. Again, you see contacts with continental literature, especially France. Even before Nietzsche had published his Birth of Tragedy in 72, or even before Pater, actually, Swinburne had heralded what would become a dominant trend in the last decades, looking back to Greece and the Renaissance, not only the Middle Ages, looking back to Greece and the Renaissance. His verse is very complex. It has its own beauty. It's completely original. So if you want to have a look, maybe you can. I think I have provided one or two samples. But of course, there are so many things about the Victorian era we must examine. I didn't go into excerpts. They are just provided for you to enjoy, basically, and to get an idea of what it sounds like. So yeah, masochistic proclivities, yes, yeah, Dionysus and all that, yeah, in a way that summarizes Swinburne. Then, much later on, 80s and 90s, we find a number of aesthetes. Wilde himself published his poems, and also famously the Ballad of Reading Gaol, which is a long confessional poem about his stay in prison. I'll mention three. Ernest Dowson, who was, decadent English poet. He was part of the Rhymers Club, which was a sort of loose society of poets involving people like W.B. Yates and all the other people contributing to the Yellow Book and the Savoy, the key decadent magazines of the 90s. And you can often see him at the Café Royal, which still exists in London, which was one of the usual meeting places of those decadents. Arthur Simmons, direct disciple of Walter Pater, and again, completely under French influence. He spoke fluent French. He was in direct contact with French literary life throughout his life. He was an authority on Baudelaire, and he revealed the ideas of Stéphane Mallarmé to England with a famous essay, The Symbolist Movement in Literature, published in the Yellow Book, of course. I've already mentioned Manley, I think, who was a professor of English. Simmons also translated D'Annunzio, and okay, again, this goes to show you how much English literature in the late Victorian period is in connection with the continent. So here I have given you two specimens of the Yellow Book and the Savoy covers. Well, of course, who is the artist? Obviously, it has to be Aubrey Beardsley, of course. Next, we will end with a number of isolated figures. We have again pessimists, people who somehow, this is beyond Darwin, don't forget, Darwin famously published his Origin of Species in 59, and it took some time, but Darwinism morphed into social Darwinism, that is, taking the logical consequences out of Darwin's theories, though Darwin himself never actually thought of these things, resulting in the idea that only the fittest would survive, also in social terms, and therefore that the world, the social world, was as pitiless as the biological world. So, typical James Thompson. Thompson was a Scot originally. He had a very, very sad life, and he spent his whole life struggling with insomnia and depression. And this is what you find in The City of Dreadful Night. Great collection, actually, but okay, totally depressive. Dark poem after dark poem. He describes a city which is not named, but it's almost like a Dante's Inferno in an urban version. It's mostly nighttime, and it's really dreadful. Then we have Gerald Manley Hopkins. That's a different story. He was a Jesuit priest whose poetry was only published after his death by a later poet laureate, Robert Bridges. He was a valetudinarian, near recluse. He invented his own prosody meter, to keep it simple. He called that sprung rhythm. He also invented new concepts, inscape, in-stress, but okay, if you're interested, you can research this, but this is not really the key thing. He was tutored by Pater at Oxford. So you see, yet again, you have the same connection. He was influenced by the poems of Christina Rossetti. He was definitely, as you might imagine, high church. He, of course, converted to Catholicism, and he became a Jesuit. These are very intense poems. They are religious, but oddly enough, they are also intensely sensuous and even erotic, you might say. Keatsian, at any rate. Then we have Hardy, because Hardy was not only a novelist, he was also a poet. I have already told you about Hardy, and what you find in the poems is exactly as dark and bleak as what you find in the novels. It's all about the cruelty of fate. Then we have Kipling. Kipling is known as a novelist, but he was also, of course, a poet. Well, you like him or you hate him. It's up to you, but you can't deny his poems have remained classics. So you'll have a go at his poems if you're interested. He was definitely jingoistic at times. You know, he was the first to invent this phrase to describe the Germans as the Huns. He also supported unionism in Ulster and lots of other things. Nonetheless, well, there's a quality to his poems, but it's definitely, and maybe you can also find some other form of pessimism in his poems. Last, Houseman. E Hazmat. Hazmat was a classical scholar by profession, really of international reputation. His fame mainly rests on a single collection, A Shropshire Lad, 1896. 63 little poems, a real masterpiece of, well, again, I'm afraid, doom. It's all about a young man who lives and dies. He never actually visited Shropshire. He had invented this lad in his misfortunes. It could have been a reflection of somebody he was in love with, but who died young. So maybe the interest here is that the pessimism is somehow foreshadowing the First World War. We're definitely going into the 20th century here. So lots of pessimism in those later poets, apart from the aesthetes. I must conclude with the only great one, because the ones I've mentioned were, you might say, okay, maybe not as fundamental poets as the great ones, as great as Tennyson, as great as Browning, as great as Arnold. William Butler Yates, of course, who became a Nobel Prize. I don't know if that's his main title for fame, certainly not, but it gives you an idea of the international dimension of the character. He is beyond all these various strands of pessimism. He introduces renewal. He was a young Irishman. He had contacts with the PreRaphaelites. He had contacts with the poetry of Tennyson, with the essays of Pater, with Wilde, and when the whole family moved to London in 1887, Yates was a co-founder of this club, Poets Club I've mentioned, the Rhymers Club. And if you want to really understand the period, I strongly suggest his autobiographies. It's a book of memoirs, of course, which gives you everything about the 90s. In terms of poetry, his early collections somehow take up all the various influences, but he brings in something completely new, which is his own mysticism and the Celtic element, because young Yates is famous for an essay, a collection of stories and essays called The Celtic Twilight, which was published in 1893. In it, he uses the old mythology and folklore of Ireland to bring something completely new, and which is in fact not pessimistic at first, because later on he too became sort of pessimistic about the future of civilization. But when young, he was looking for total freedom. Maybe it's summarized in his famous poem about the Lake Isle of Innisfree, where a young man decides to go on an island, on a lake, and to build for himself a completely new life, starting from scratch. He was also interested in Japanese Noh. He experimented with new verse patterns. He was a budding genius, but of course the most important part of his work will be published later on in the 20th century, but I had to mention him here at the end of the period. Finally, as usual, and of course Synge too was not only a playwright, he was also a poet. At the end, as usual, I have to mention, those film and TV references. And again, we've got tons. Documentary on late Victorian times. There is one fairly recent, Victorian Sensations. It's a 3-part series about almost the turning of the century, you might say. This is why it's so interesting, how late Victorian ideas already point towards the 20th century. In terms of individual authors, there are some great film adaptations of the novels of Thomas Hardy. Far from the Madding Crowd, John Schlesinger, 67, total classic. There's The Mayor of Casterbridge, very good TV adaptation in 2003, and, oh yes, Tess, directed by Roman Polanski. It's a film classic. Wild, well, we've got a fairly good biography by Brian Gilbert. There's the recent film by the British actor Rupert Everett, The Happy Prince, about the late years of Oscar Wilde. And there's this timeless film classic adaptation of The Picture of Dorian Gray by Albert Lewin. Stevenson, well, you might have seen one of the many, many adaptations of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I'm still fond of the old 1941 adaptation. About the PreRaphaelites, well, again, I have listed it. There's a very nice film about George Moore and Esther Waters. Conrad, of course, many, many films. And I couldn't resist mentioning Henry James, though, as I said, he is we have to consider him as an American writer. So my recommendation would be The Wings of the Dove, because that gives you an idea of this, of this late Victorian, and with this one, even you might say Edwardian society. Right, well, that's it for the last lecture.